Good. I'll see you later.
Alrighty, I'm headed out to Albuquerque, everyone. Hi, this is Gretchen. She's going to tell you all the news that's fit to print. Love you.
Bye now.
See you later.
Well, here we are. I'm going to start. Curtis has been after me for some time to try to record some of the incidents of interest in my life. I think because I am now 95 and still have a pretty sharp recollection of my events in my life, I think it is of some importance that I try to tell you the story of my life as I remember it. It's not easy to begin this kind of a thing because one feels rather self-conscious and uneasy, but I will start with a little bit of background about where I came from, who my parents are, and what I remember about the early life of my parents. My life began on January 28th, 1923, in Winnipeg, Canada. I was born in the General Hospital of Winnipeg. I think my father told me that he took my mother in 2 or 3 days before I was born because the weather was intensely cold and he was afraid that it might, in case of a storm or something of that nature, he wouldn't be able to get mother into the hospital. So I was born in the hospital on a very, very cold night. As I recall, someone told me later that my mother had recorded, I think they recorded 42 below zero. And of course that was in the middle of the winter, so it was very, very bitterly cold. I think mother kept me in the hospital for about a week, and then they took me home. How did I get to Canada? Well, it was a sort of an interesting story. My grandfather Young, who I never knew, had died probably about I would want to say maybe 1919, 18 or 19, right after the First World War. He was a farmer and a banker in Ringsted, Iowa, which is a little town up in the northern part of the state, I think not too far from the Minnesota border. He was somewhat of a speculator, and he, along with several other farmers who had some money to invest at that point, decided that they would go into the real estate market and see what they could find in the way of a sort of a venture type of investment. And they found some land up in southern Manitoba that was on the market for a very low say, I think, for back taxes. Manitoba had gone through quite an extended period of drought and dry weather. The wheat crop, which was their principal crop, had declined. Wheat crop had just dried up. And so a lot of farmers went broke at that point and gave up their farms. And so the taxes built up that had not been paid, and they put this land on the market. So my grandfather Young, along with several other investors, bought up this land. Well, in the meantime, my father, who was now out of college, decided that he would be willing to go up there and try to make a living off that land, hoping, of course, that the drought uh, would cease and that they would begin to have good wet weather to support their crops. So in 1919, my dad was probably about through college. He had he had had a funny experience, a rather strange experience, in that he had sort of rebelled against his mother's determination that he would finish high school with a course in Latin. My dad didn't see any reason to take Latin, and so he just left school. And he went, after he had been out of school a time, he decided to go to Ames and get what was called a 2-year ag course. And so he started at Iowa State, and then because he wanted to be a farmer, and so he, for one reason, whatever reason, I'm not sure, he went over to Cedar Falls and took a course in the State Teachers College, which would allow him to be able to finish out his high school education and go on to college. And so he finished that, and then he had started to play football over at Cedar Falls, and he thought that was a lot of fun. So he didn't want to quit that, so he decided to go back to Ames and enroll in a full 4-year college course, which would allow him to take a college degree and also play football. So that's what he had done. So actually he was out of college when he and my mother met, probably in about 1919. I'm not sure of these dates because there's no real record that I've been able to turn up telling me exactly when he went over to Ames to begin with, on to Cedar Falls and back to Ames. I think, let me think about this for a minute. I think there was a period of time when he might have, well, I know he was conscripted or enlisted in the Army because at that time the war was still going on, and the United States had gone into, I'm talking about World War I, United States had gone into the war, and college students who were close to finishing their degree and in a curriculum which was somehow useful to the war effort, and farming certainly was because of the need for producing food. Anyhow, he had been enlisted, and he was actually in uniform, but still in college. Well, then the armistice happened, and that was all changed. He met my mother, and while he was in college, and mother had not gone to Iowa State. She had gone to DePauw University. That's another story which I can refer to later. But mother and dad were married in 1921. They were married in the home of my aunt and uncle, Laura and Seaman Knapp, by my grandfather, mother's father, who was an ordained Methodist minister. They were married in Ames, and very shortly thereafter, they left for Canada. Now that was an interesting development in my mind as I think about it. My mother was born in a very genteel and what we might call a rather protected background. Grandfather had been a minister, but he had been called to Des Moines for the purpose of pastoring the Central Methodist Church. And while there, he was invited to become the president of Iowa State. Colleges at that time were still very closely affiliated with denominations of different names. For instance, the Congregational or the Methodist or the Presbyterian churches often sponsored their, had heavy endorsements and investments in four-year colleges. Anyhow, Grandfather went to Ames as president of Iowa State, and I don't have an exact picture of when he went, but my guess is that it was about 1895. The year my mother was born my mother was born in Detroit. Now, how they got to Detroit, I'm not sure, but he was still working as a minister in local congregations. So when they left Detroit, came to Des Moines, my mother was a very young child. Anyhow, my mother was a remarkable woman. She was probably had the strongest influence on my life of any one individual. My father was a delightful, wonderful person. I loved him dearly. He was gone much of my time because the work that he ended up doing before and after the Depression necessitated his being away from home. Oftentimes, Monday through Friday, he would be out in the state meeting and working with farmers who were trying to save their farms or live on the minimum income. The United States Department of Agriculture, for whom he worked, had a program under the Roosevelt New Deal called the Rural Resettlement Administration. I think you can tell my speech is a little bit interfered with, but doesn't seem to have bothered my memory at this point. Anyhow, Mother and Dad went, as soon as they were married, went to Canada. And I always thought this was an exciting and romantic adventure for both of them. Certainly Mother demonstrated her willingness to be a real adventurous, because she had never left her home except to go to college. It was a very austere, rather, I guess you would say, protected atmosphere at DuPont. And then after she finished college, she graduated with a major in sociology, as I recall. And she went to Chicago and worked in what was then the very famous Jane Addams Hull House. Jane Addams was a social worker. In those days, social workers and women were very rare in the professional fields. And Mother worked at the Hull House probably for at least a year before Aunt Laura and Uncle Stephen prevailed upon her to come back to Ames. I think they thought she might have been somewhat of a wild card running around Chicago unmarried. And Mother was always she was a bit of a rebel. when she was at DePaul, she was disciplined rather sharply. I think for dancing on Sunday, maybe for dancing at all. I'm not sure whether dancing was allowed in the church-related college in DePaul. But anyhow, she was also caught smoking. And of course, in those days, young women smoking was just absolutely taboo. There were very strict social patterns, mores for women to follow. Anyhow, she ended up at Ames, and Uncle Seaman, who was working at the Trust and Savings Bank at that time, got her a job there. So while she was working there, she met a fellow from Iowa State who was in a fraternity, Sigma Alpha Epsilon, and he introduced her to my dad. Mother went out on a blind date with him, I guess, and they hit it off pretty well, so they continued to date, and that was how my mother and dad met and eventually married. That fellow that introduced my mother and dad ended up being a very close friend of my family, and I knew his children who came along after he married. His daughter, Betty, was one of my closest friends, and for a number of years we lived next door to each other in Ames. Well, anyhow, my mother and dad had a wonderful, wonderful love affair and romance, and it really lasted all the way through until my dad died in 1956. He used to call my sisters and myself to one side and say, "Girls, you don't realize what a remarkable woman your mother is. She is the most wonderful woman you could imagine, and I want you never to forget that." I don't know how many times he must have told us that as we were growing up. He absolutely worshipped Mother, and Mother was just a beautiful young woman, and she had a beautiful, beautiful contralto voice. She was in demand all over Ames and the surrounding areas for providing music with her voice for many different occasions. She sang at all kinds of places and many different denominations of churches. She sang in the Catholic Church when we weren't even allowed to go near a Catholic church. She would go and sing the Easter Mass or something of that nature, and she enjoyed doing this. I think her most remarkable performances were as a contralto soloist for the Messiah at Christmas time that the chorus at Iowa State presented, and made a particular effort to draw people from all over the area. It was a grand occasion, and I remember being extremely proud of my mother's performance. It was beautiful. Well, Mother and Dad then came back, well, they were in Minnesota for in Canada for probably about 7 years, because I was born there in 23. My sister Norma was born there in 27, and they had been married in 1921 when they went to Canada, and I think they stayed in Canada until my sister was probably 6 to 8 months old, so that would have been 6 to 7 years. It's too bad that we don't have exact records of those years, but Mother loved that time in Canada. She was a very adventurous kind of woman. She loved meeting new people and making friends, and she learned probably more about homemaking and housekeeping in those years than she had all her life, because she had never really been in a situation where she had to do that, those kind of things. She wasn't by nature a person who had been taught the art of homemaking. So anyhow, Mother and Dad came back to Ames when my sister Norma was still very young, maybe a year or so old. And we lived in Ames. Then my dad was with an organization called the American Horse Association. He was, at that time, of course, horses were extremely important to the agricultural industry, and there was no such thing as motorized equipment to operate farm equipment. So Father was worked for the American Horse Association and went all over the country, I think, demonstrating what was called multiple hitches for horses in harness when they were being used to cultivate fields. And so he would go to county fairs and put on these demonstrations of multiple hitch horses. And I remember seeing pictures of 8 and 12 horses all under one set of reins in harness under one driver. And I recall there was a picture of President and Mrs. Coolidge at one of the fairs where he was making this demonstration. I saw the pictures of the Coolidges. So that was sort of my life up until the Depression hit, which was 1929. At that time, we were living in Iowa, at Ames, and I think my aunt and uncle, Laura and Seaman, were sort of, in a way, sort of sponsoring my father and mother as they began their life in Iowa. Well, this was an interesting development that I had was not aware of at all until many years later, when as a young college girl I went to get a job in the summertime at the local munitions factory. World War II had begun, and the little town of Ankeny, for some reason, was used as an area for developing munitions for the First World War, the Second World War, I'm sorry. This was in 1941. I went to get this job and found out that because of my birth in Canada, I was considered an enemy alien. Now that was because of the fact that I had what was known as a dual citizenship, and I had never chosen the preference that I would have as to having a citizenship in either America or Canada. I didn't even know that such a thing existed. Well, after I found out that I had this dual citizenship, and I was a young college student, I began the process of naturalization. And believe it or not, I actually had to go through the whole process of naturalization. I now have in my files a certificate showing that I am a naturalized citizen of the United States, because I finally indicated my preference as a student as a young adult. I think I was probably 18 or 19 at that time. Well, I sort of backed off and I'm going to close for a while, and so that I can sort of regroup and get myself started on another branch of my life. So I'm going to turn off this machine.